The snow fell like judgment on the Colorado Territory. Each flake another reminder that winter showed no mercy to those with nowhere to go. Rebecca Collins knelt in the mud outside the Hartwell Ranch, her once respectable dress now torn and stained beyond recognition, her bare knees soaking through the thin fabric as she pressed her palms together in desperate supplication. "Please, Mr. Hartwell," she whispered, her voice cracking with exhaustion and hunger. "I'll do any work you have. Cooking, cleaning, mending, tending animals. I'll sleep in the barn. I won't cause trouble. I just need—" She couldn't finish the sentence. She just needed to survive another day. The man standing before her was a giant silhouetted against the gray winter sky, broad-shouldered, weathered by frontier life, with eyes that had seen too much hardship to trust easily. James Hartwell owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, and every desperate soul for 100 miles eventually found their way to his door when hope ran out everywhere else. But what Rebecca didn't know was that James Hartwell had been watching her for 3 days. He'd seen her sleeping in his hay barn, careful not to take more than the horse's warmth. He'd seen her mending a broken fence post without being asked, her frozen fingers working with the precision of someone who knew real labor. He'd seen her share the last of her meager food with a stray dog that had found its way to the ranch. Most men would have seen a burden, a destitute woman with no family, no references, no prospects. But James Hartwell had learned to look deeper than appearances. 20 years of running a ranch had taught him that desperation either broke people or revealed their true character. And this woman, kneeling in his muddy yard with dignity somehow intact despite her circumstances, had something most of his hired hands lacked. She had the fire of someone who refused to give up. Behind James, framed in the warm glow of the ranch house windows, a small face appeared, his 6-year-old son Tommy, who hadn't spoken a word since his mother died 2 years ago. The boy watched the scene with solemn eyes that held too much understanding for his age, eyes that had seen his father turn away dozens of drifters and job seekers throughout the harsh winter. But something about this woman was different. Even Tommy could sense it. What happened next would shock everyone who thought they knew James Hartwell's heart. Because the hardened rancher who never took charity cases, who had a reputation for being fair but ruthless in business, was about to make a decision that would change 3 lives forever. As Rebecca Collins knelt in the snow, believing she was begging for mere survival, she had no idea she was about to discover what it meant to be truly valued. Not for what she could offer, but for who she was when everything else had been stripped away. The answer James gave her would become the foundation of a love story that proved worth isn't measured by what you have, but by what you're willing to give when you have nothing left to lose. James Hartwell looked down at the woman kneeling in his muddy yard, her torn dress and desperate eyes telling a story he'd heard too many times before. The Colorado Territory was littered with folks who'd run out of luck, out of hope, out of everything except the will to keep breathing for one more day. Most men would have given her a meal and sent her on her way with maybe $1 for the road. James Hartwell was not most men. "Get up," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Nobody kneels in my yard except to pray, and I don't think that's what you're doing." Rebecca struggled to her feet, her legs cramped from the cold and her pride stinging from the humiliation of begging. She'd been a school teacher once, back in Pennsylvania before her father's debts caught up with them, before the scandal that drove her family west, before everything fell apart like dominoes in a windstorm. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hartwell. I didn't mean to offend." "What's your name?" James interrupted, studying her face with the same careful attention he gave to horses he was thinking of buying. "Rebecca Collins." She lifted her chin slightly, some echo of her former dignity reasserting itself. "I've been teaching school for 8 years. I can read and write in cipher. I can cook, clean, mend clothing, tend wounds, manage household accounts. I've worked in my father's store, helped birth babies, nursed the sick. I'll do any honest work you have." James nodded slowly. He'd been watching her for 3 days, and her actions had already told him more about her character than her words ever could. She hadn't stolen anything despite having ample opportunity. She'd mended his fence without being asked. She'd shared her last piece of bread with a half-starved dog. "Can you handle livestock?" "I grew up on a farm before my father moved us to town. I know my way around cattle and horses." Can you handle men who think a woman's got no business giving them orders? Rebecca's eyes flashed with something harder than desperation. I've been handling men who underestimate me my whole life, Mr. Hartwell. A ghost of a smile crossed James's weathered face. I expect you have. He was quiet for a long moment, weighing his decision against 15 years of running a ranch by keeping emotion out of business choices. But something about this woman reminded him of his late wife Sarah, not in looks, but in the steel spine hidden beneath a deceptively gentle exterior. I've got a proposition for you, Miss Collins. Not charity, mind you, but a job offer. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs. What kind of job? My foreman quit 2 weeks ago. Couldn't handle the isolation out here. Wanted to head back to civilization. James gestured toward the sprawling ranch spread out beneath the gray winter sky. I've got 40 head of cattle, 12 horses, and a 6-year-old boy who hasn't spoken since his mother died. I need someone who can manage the house, help with the stock, and maybe... He paused, looking toward the window where Tommy's small face was still pressed against the glass. Maybe help a little boy remember what it's like to have someone care about him. Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford. What are you offering for wages? Room and board plus $20 a month. It's hard work, Miss Collins. Dawn to dusk, 7 days a week. The nearest neighbor is 10 miles away, and the town's a day's ride in good weather. You'd be isolated out here with just me and Tommy for company most of the time. $20 a month was more than Rebecca had hoped to see in the next year. It was enough to buy decent clothes, enough to save for a future that didn't involve begging for work in strangers' yards. Why? She asked quietly. You don't know anything about me. I could be a thief, or worse. James looked at her for a long moment. I've been watching you for 3 days, Miss Collins. You slept in my barn without taking anything that wasn't freely given. You mended my fence without being asked and without expecting payment. You shared your food with a stray dog when you barely had enough for yourself. He paused. A person's character shows clearest when they think nobody's watching. Rebecca felt something crack open in her chest, a place that had been frozen solid with despair and humiliation. Someone had been watching, and instead of seeing a burden or a failure, he'd seen someone worth helping. When would I start? Right now, if you're willing. First thing you can do is get yourself cleaned up and into some warm clothes. Sarah's things are still in the wardrobe upstairs. You're about her size, I reckon. The mention of his dead wife should have made Rebecca uncomfortable, but something in James's tone told her this wasn't about replacing someone irreplaceable. This was about practical necessity and human kindness. Mr. Hartwell, I want you to know that I'll work harder than any man you've ever hired. I won't let you down. I'm counting on it, James replied. And Miss Collins? The name's James. We don't stand on ceremony out here. As Rebecca followed James toward the house, she caught sight of herself in the reflection of a water trough. Hair tangled and dirty, dress torn and stained, face gaunt from too many meals skipped. She looked like what she was, a woman who'd hit rock bottom and was clawing her way back up one desperate day at a time. But for the first time in months, she felt something besides despair. She felt hope. The ranch house was larger than it had appeared from outside, built with the solid craftsmanship of someone who meant to stay put. The main room served as both kitchen and parlor, with a massive stone fireplace that threw welcome heat into the space. Everything was clean, but showed the neglect of a man trying to manage too much alone, dishes stacked but not properly put away, laundry folded but left in baskets, the kind of surface order that spoke of someone doing their best but falling short. Tommy, James called toward the stairs. Come down here, son. I want you to meet Miss Collins. The boy who descended the stairs was small for 6, with his father's dark hair and eyes that held too much sorrow for someone who should still believe in magic. He stopped halfway down and regarded Rebecca with the solemn assessment of a child who'd learned that adults weren't always permanent fixtures in his world. Hello, Tommy, Rebecca said gently, crouching down to put herself at his eye level. I'm going to be helping your father around the ranch for a while. Tommy didn't respond, but he didn't run away either. He simply watched her with those grave eyes, taking her measure just as his father had done. "He'll warm up to you," James said quietly. "Just takes time." He wasn't always so quiet. Rebecca nodded, understanding. Grief hit children differently than adults, often stealing their voices when words felt too dangerous to trust. "The room upstairs on the left is yours," James continued. "Get yourself cleaned up and rested. Tomorrow we'll start showing you how things work around here. And Miss Collins?" He paused as she reached the foot of the stairs. "Welcome to the Hartwell Ranch." As Rebecca climbed the stairs toward what would be the first real room she'd had in months, she felt the weight of desperation beginning to lift from her shoulders. She'd arrived at this ranch broken and begging, with nothing to offer but her willingness to work. But James Hartwell had seen something in her that she'd almost forgotten existed. Her worth as a human being who deserved a chance to rebuild her life. Behind her, she heard the murmur of James's voice as he spoke quietly to his son, and the soft sound of a fire being banked for the night. For the first time since her world had fallen apart, Rebecca Collins was part of something larger than her own survival. She was part of a family that needed healing just as much as she did. And tomorrow she would begin the work of proving that sometimes the most broken people were also the strongest, once they found the right place to take root and grow again. Rebecca woke before dawn on her first morning at the Hartwell Ranch, her body still aching from months of sleeping on the ground and in hay barns. But the bed she'd slept in was the softest thing she'd felt in half a year, and the clean nightgown she wore, one of Sarah Hartwell's, made her feel almost human again. She dressed quickly in a simple brown work dress that had belonged to James's late wife, rolling up the sleeves and tying an apron around her waist. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Clean hair braided back, face washed, wearing clothes that fit properly. She looked like a woman with purpose instead of a desperate drifter. Downstairs, she found James already at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a ledger spread before him, making notes by lamplight. He looked up when she entered and something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or approval. "Morning," he said simply. "Coffee's on the stove." Rebecca poured herself a cup and stood by the window, watching the first pale light creep across the snow-covered pastures. "What time do the hands usually start work?" "Don't have any regular hands right now. Just me and old Pete, who comes by twice a week to help with the heavy lifting. Been making do since my foreman quit, but it's been..." He gestured at the ledger with obvious frustration. "Challenging." Rebecca set down her coffee cup and moved to look over his shoulder at the columns of figures. Years of helping her father with his store accounts had taught her to read financial records, and what she saw made her stomach clench. The ranch was profitable, but barely. Too much going out in expenses, not enough coming in from cattle sales. "You're feeding 40 head through the winter?" "Have to. Can't sell them until spring roundup, and they need hay and grain to survive until the grass comes back." Rebecca studied the numbers more carefully. "What about the horses?" "You've got 12 listed here, but I only saw 8 in the corral yesterday." James looked up sharply. "You counted them?" "Habit. My father always said you can't manage what you don't measure." Rebecca traced a line in the ledger with her finger. "If you've got 4 horses unaccounted for, that's either a theft problem or a record-keeping problem." "They're up in the north pasture with the breeding stock," James said slowly. "But you're right, they should be listed separately. They're worth more than the working horses." Rebecca nodded and moved to the stove, where she began assembling breakfast from the supplies she'd found in the pantry. "Have you thought about selective breeding? Your horses have good bone structure, but if you bred for specific traits, speed, endurance, temperament, you could get premium prices from the army or the stage lines." James set down his pen and stared at her. "Where'd you learn about horse breeding?" "My uncle raised thoroughbreds back in Pennsylvania. I spent summers helping him with bloodline records and sales." Rebecca cracked eggs into a skillet, keeping her voice casual. "Course, that was before my father's difficulties." She didn't elaborate, and James didn't push. They both understood that everyone in the territory was running from something. Failure, scandal, heartbreak, or just the suffocating weight of other people's expectations. Tommy appeared in the doorway, dressed but still tousled from sleep. He regarded Rebecca with the same solemn wariness as the day before, but he came to the table when his father gestured to a chair. Morning, sweetheart, Rebecca said gently, setting a plate of eggs and biscuits in front of him. Did you sleep well? Tommy nodded once but didn't speak. James watched the interaction with careful attention, noting how Rebecca didn't push for conversation, but simply included the boy in her movements around the kitchen. What's the plan for today? Rebecca asked as she served James's breakfast. Need to check the cattle, make sure they're staying close to the windbreaks. Then there's firewood to split, and the roof on the barn's got a leak that needs patching before the next storm. James paused. Of course, that's assuming you meant what you said about being able to handle ranch work. Rebecca met his gaze steadily. Try me. An hour later, bundled in Sarah's winter coat and wearing James's spare pair of work gloves, Rebecca followed him out to the pastures where the cattle clustered near the shelter of a rocky outcropping. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the wind cut through even the heavy wool, but Rebecca kept pace without complaint. See that heifer there, the one standing apart from the others? James pointed to a young cow who was pawing restlessly at the snow. She's been acting strange for 2 days. Could be she's coming down with something. Rebecca studied the animal, noting the way it held its head and the slightly labored breathing visible in the cold air. Or she could be pregnant and getting ready to calve. James looked at her sharply. It's the wrong time of year for calving. Not if she was bred late or if she's a first-time mother. Sometimes their timing's off. Rebecca moved closer to the heifer, speaking in low, soothing tones. The animal allowed her to approach, even lifting its head for gentle scratching behind the ears. Feel right here, Rebecca said, guiding James's hand to the cow's flank. Feel that? She's carrying, and by the movement, I'd say she's close. James felt the subtle shift beneath his palm and swore softly. If she drops a calf in this weather, we'll need to get her into the barn and keep her warm. The calf won't survive if it's born outside. Rebecca was already moving, using her body and voice to gently guide the heifer toward the barn. You got straw and blankets? What followed was 6 hours of the hardest work Rebecca had done since arriving at the ranch. The heifer went into labor just as they got her settled in a stall, and the calf was presenting wrong. Breech position that required careful maneuvering to avoid losing both mother and baby. Rebecca worked with calm efficiency, her sleeves rolled up, and her hands steady as she helped guide the calf into the world. James watched in amazement as she handled the situation with the expertise of someone who'd done this before, many times. There, Rebecca said finally, as a healthy bull calf slipped free and began breathing on his own. Welcome to the world, little one. The mother cow immediately began cleaning her baby, and Rebecca sat back on her heels, exhausted but triumphant. She was covered in mud and worse, her hair had come loose from its braid, and she looked nothing like the desperate woman who'd begged for work just yesterday. She looked like she belonged. Where'd you learn to do that? James asked quietly. Uncle Marcus again. He always said birthing was the most important skill a rancher could have. Rebecca wiped her hands on a towel and smiled. Looks like he was right. That evening, after Rebecca had cleaned up and changed clothes, she found Tommy sitting by the kitchen window, watching the new calf in the barn through the glass. She settled beside him with her mending, not speaking but simply sharing the comfortable quiet. After a few minutes, Tommy turned to look at her. Is the baby going to be okay? He asked, his voice rusty from disuse but clear. Rebecca's heart stuttered with joy, but she kept her expression calm. I think so. His mama's taking good care of him, and your papa made sure they have everything they need. Tommy nodded solemnly. Mama used to help with the babies too, before she got sick. She sounds like she was a smart woman, Rebecca said gently, like someone who knew that taking care of things is one of the most important jobs there is. Are you going to stay? Tommy asked, his eyes wide and serious. Rebecca looked out at the barn where the calf was nursing strongly, then at the warm kitchen where James sat working on his ledgers, then back at the little boy who had spoken his first words in months. I'd like to, she said honestly, if your papa thinks I'm doing a good job. Tommy considered this gravely. I think you are. You helped the cow, and you made good biscuits, and you don't try to make me talk when I don't want to. Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. Thank you, Tommy. That means a lot to me. From across the room, James looked up from his ledger and caught the end of their conversation. His son was talking again. Not just talking, but asking questions and expressing opinions. And the woman he'd hired out of equal parts desperation and intuition was proving to be exactly what his family needed. Later that night, as Rebecca climbed the stairs to her room, James called her name softly. "Rebecca, that was good work today, with the calf, with Tommy, all of it." She turned on the stairs to look down at him. "Thank you for giving me the chance to prove myself." "You've done more than prove yourself," James said quietly. "You've reminded me what this place could be, with the right person helping to run it." As Rebecca continued up to her room, she felt something warm and unfamiliar settling in her chest. For the first time since her world had fallen apart, she felt valued not just for her willingness to work, but for her skills, her knowledge, her to make a real difference. She was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to thrive. And in the process, she was helping to heal a family that had forgotten what wholeness looked like. Behind her, James sat in his kitchen, listening to the sounds of his house settling around him. But for the first time in 2 years, it didn't feel empty. It felt like a home where people cared about each other and worked towards something larger than themselves. Rebecca Collins had arrived as a desperate woman with nothing to offer but her labor. But she was becoming something else entirely, an indispensable part of what made the Hartwell Ranch work. And though neither of them would admit it yet, she was becoming exactly what James had been hoping to find without even knowing he was looking for it. 3 weeks into Rebecca's employment at the Hartwell Ranch, the worst blizzard in a decade descended on the Colorado Territory like the wrath of an angry god. The storm struck without warning on what had started as a clear February morning, transforming the world into a howling, white nightmare, where a man could lose his way between the house and barn and freeze to death 20 yards from safety. Rebecca stood at the kitchen window, watching the snow pile against the glass in drifts that already reached the sill. The wind screamed around the house with a voice that seemed almost human, rattling windows and finding every crack in the walls to send icy fingers into the warm interior. "How long do these storms usually last?" she asked James, who was checking their supplies with the methodical care of a man who'd survived frontier winters before. "Could be 3 days. Could be a week." James's expression was grim as he counted cans of beans and flour sacks. "Depends on how angry Mother Nature's feeling." Tommy pressed against Rebecca's side, seeking comfort from the frightening sounds outside. She wrapped an arm around the boy's shoulders, feeling him tremble. Whether from cold or fear, she couldn't tell. "The cattle," Rebecca said suddenly, realization hitting her like a physical blow. "They're still in the north pasture." James's jaw tightened. "Nothing we can do about them now. Storm came up too fast to bring them in. We'll just have to hope they find shelter behind the ridge and ride it out." But Rebecca was already moving, pulling on Sarah's heavy winter coat and wrapping a scarf around her neck. "I saw them this morning when I was checking the water troughs. They were huddled near the old line shack, but that building's not going to protect them if the wind shifts." "Rebecca, no." James caught her arm as she reached for the door. "You'll be dead before you make it halfway there. This isn't some gentle snowfall. This is a killer storm." Rebecca looked at him steadily, then at Tommy's frightened face. "Those cattle represent half your income for the year. If we lose them, the ranch fails. And if the ranch fails—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what happened to failed ranches in the territory. Foreclosure, families scattered to the wind, dreams buried under debt and desperation. "I know these pastures," Rebecca continued. "I've been walking them every day for 3 weeks. I can find the cattle and guide them to the lower valley, where the trees will break the wind." "It's suicide," James said flatly. "I won't let you risk your life for a few head of cattle." Rebecca pulled free of his grip and faced him squarely. "Those aren't just cattle to you, James. They're your future, Tommy's future. And I won't stand here safe and warm while everything you've worked for dies in a blizzard." Before James could stop her, she was out the door and into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical assault, stealing the breath from her lungs and making her eyes water instantly. The wind drove snow into her face with stinging force, and within seconds she could barely see the outline of the barn through the white chaos. But Rebecca had grown up in Pennsylvania winters, and she learned long ago that survival meant planning ahead and moving with purpose. She wrapped the rope from the barn around her waist, creating a lifeline back to safety, and began the treacherous journey toward the north pasture. The storm tried to kill her a dozen times in the first 100 yards. Wind gusts knocked her sideways into drifts that came up to her chest. Snow filled her boots and soaked through her gloves, numbing her fingers until she could barely feel the rope that was her only connection to survival. But Rebecca kept moving, following the fence line when she could see it, relying on instinct and memory when the world disappeared into white nothing. She thought about Tommy's shy smile when she'd praised his arithmetic, about James's quiet approval when she'd balanced the ranch books, about the new calf who depended on the herd for protection. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 weeks ago, desperate, broken, begging for any chance to prove her worth. That woman would never have walked into a blizzard to save someone else's cattle, but the woman she was becoming would risk anything to protect the people who'd given her a second chance at life. It took her 2 hours to reach the cattle, following a path that should have taken 30 minutes in clear weather. She found them exactly where she'd expected, huddled against the old line shack, steam rising from their bodies as they pressed together for warmth. The cattle were in bad shape but still alive. The problem was getting them moving in the right direction when they couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. Rebecca untied the rope from her waist and fashioned a crude halter around the lead cow's head. If she could get the dominant animal moving, the others would follow by instinct. "Come on, girl," she whispered through numb lips. "Let's get you home." What followed was the longest, coldest, most terrifying hour of Rebecca's life. She led the cattle through drifts that sometimes swallowed her to the waist, across ground so treacherous that one wrong step could send her tumbling into a ravine. The wind never stopped screaming, and the snow never stopped falling. And more than once she was certain she'd lost her way completely. But gradually the landscape began to look familiar. The grove of cottonwoods that marked the entrance to the lower valley, the rocky outcropping that provided natural windbreak, the fence posts that meant safety and home. By the time Rebecca guided the last cow into the sheltered valley, she was beyond exhaustion. Her legs shook with every step. Her hands were so numb she couldn't feel the rope anymore, and ice had formed on her eyelashes until she could barely see. But the cattle were safe. The journey back to the house was a blur of white and cold and the mechanical placement of one foot in front of the other. Rebecca followed the fence line by feel more than sight, her entire world reduced to the simple goal of reaching the next post, then the next, then the next. When the barn finally loomed out of the storm, she almost cried with relief. She stumbled through the door just as James emerged from the house, his face wild with worry and something that looked like fury. "Are you completely insane?" he shouted over the wind. "I've been going out of my mind for 3 hours, thinking you were dead in a drift somewhere." Rebecca pulled off her frozen gloves with fingers that barely worked. "The cattle are in the lower valley. They're safe." James stared at her for a moment, taking in her ice-covered clothes and blue-tinged lips. Then without warning, he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Don't you ever do anything that stupid again," he said fiercely against her ear. "I don't care about the cattle. I care about you." Rebecca felt something warm and powerful unfurl in her chest at his words. This wasn't gratitude for an employee who'd saved his livestock. This was something deeper, more personal. "James," she whispered, but he was already pulling back, his hands on her shoulders as he studied her face with concern. "You're half frozen. Come on, let's get you inside before you lose any fingers to frostbite." Inside the warm kitchen, Tommy launched himself at Rebecca with a sob of relief. "I thought you weren't coming back," he said, his small arms wrapping around her waist. "I thought the storm took you away like it took Mama." Rebecca's heart clenched as she understood the real source of the boy's fear. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, kneeling down to his level despite her exhaustion. "I promised your papa I'd stay and help take care of the ranch. That means I keep my promises, no matter what." As James helped her out of her wet clothes and wrapped her in warm blankets, as Tommy brought her hot coffee and sat pressed against her side, Rebecca realized something had fundamentally shifted in their little family. She was no longer the desperate woman they'd taken in out of charity. She was the woman who'd risked her life to save their future. She was the woman James trusted enough to worry about, the woman Tommy needed enough to fear losing. She was home. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage. But inside the Hartwell Ranch house, three people who'd been broken by loss and hardship were discovering what it meant to be a family again. And for the first time since her world had fallen apart, Rebecca Collins understood that sometimes the most important journeys weren't about reaching a destination. Sometimes they were about discovering you'd been strong enough all along to weather any storm life threw at you. Especially when you had people worth fighting for waiting at home. The storm would pass, spring would come, and when it did, Rebecca would face it not as a woman grateful for charity, but as a partner who'd proven her worth when it mattered most. She'd found her place in the world. Now the question was whether she'd found something even more precious, a love worth the risks she'd already taken and the challenges still to come. Spring arrived at the Hartwell Ranch like a miracle after the brutal winter that had tested everyone's endurance. The snow melted in rushing torrents that filled the creek beds. Wildflowers pushed through the soggy earth with determined optimism, and the cattle that Rebecca had saved during the blizzard grew fat on new grass that seemed to appear overnight. Rebecca stood on the porch in the early morning light, wearing one of Sarah's dresses that she'd altered to fit properly. 3 months of regular meals and hard work had transformed her from the gaunt, desperate woman who'd knelt in James's yard into someone who looked like she belonged on a successful ranch. Her hair caught the sunlight in auburn highlights. Her skin had a healthy glow from outdoor work, and her posture spoke of confidence earned through proving herself when it mattered most. "You're up early," James said, emerging from the barn with a bucket of fresh milk. He paused when he saw her, the same expression crossing his face that she'd been catching more often lately. A look of appreciation mixed with something deeper that made her pulse quicken. "Couldn't sleep. Too excited about the cattle drive to Bozeman today." Rebecca accepted the milk bucket and fell into step beside him as they walked toward the house. "How many head are we taking to market?" 22. Should bring enough to cover the winter expenses and leave us with a decent profit." James's voice carried satisfaction and something else, pride in what they'd accomplished together. "That blizzard could have wiped us out completely if we hadn't worked together," Rebecca corrected gently. "I couldn't have saved those cattle without knowing you and Tommy were here to come back to." The words hung between them with more meaning than either was quite ready to acknowledge. Over the past month, as winter gave way to spring and the daily rhythms of ranch life settled into comfortable patterns, the boundaries between employer and employee had blurred into something neither of them quite knew how to name. Tommy burst through the kitchen door with the energy of a 6-year-old who'd been cooped up all winter. "Miss Rebecca! Papa! Come look what I found!" He led them to the corral where the new calf, now strong and healthy, was being groomed by its mother. But Tommy's discovery wasn't the calf. It was a nest tucked into the corner of the fence, where a meadowlark had built her home and was sitting protectively on a clutch of speckled eggs. "She picked our ranch," Tommy said with wonder. "Out of all the places she could build her nest, she picked here." Rebecca knelt beside the boy, careful not to disturb the nesting bird. She knew this was a safe place to raise her babies. Animals can sense when people will protect them. "Like you sensed Papa would protect you," Tommy said with the direct honesty of childhood. Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks, but when she glanced at James, he was watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. There was tenderness there, and longing, and something that looked suspiciously like love. The moment was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats on the main road. A rider was approaching at a steady pace, and as he drew closer, Rebecca could see he was well-dressed and mounted on an expensive horse. Not a drifter or a ranch hand, but someone with money and position. "Expecting anyone?" Rebecca asked. James's expression had turned wary. "No, but I recognize him. That's William Garrett from the Garrett spread up north, one of the biggest ranchers in the territory. The man who dismounted in their yard was everything James wasn't. Polished, urbane, wearing clothes that came from San Francisco rather than the local general store. He was handsome in a conventional way, with silver at his temples and the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. "Hartwell," Garrett said, extending a hand that looked like it had never done manual labor. "Hope you don't mind the unannounced visit. I was in the area and thought I'd stop by." "Garrett." James's handshake was brief, polite, but cool. "What brings you this far south?" Garrett's gaze had already found Rebecca, and she saw his eyes widen slightly as he took in her appearance. She knew what he was seeing, a woman who was clearly more than a hired hand, who carried herself with education and refinement despite her practical work clothes. "Actually, I came to make you an offer," Garrett said, though his attention remained fixed on Rebecca. "I'm expanding my operation, and I could use a man with your experience managing cattle. I'd pay you well to come work for me as my foreman." "I've got my own place," James replied curtly, not interested in working for someone else. "Think about it," Garrett continued smoothly. "Winter's hard on small operations. One bad season and you could lose everything. Working for me, you'd have security, steady wages, a future for your boy." Rebecca felt something cold settle in her stomach. Garrett's offer wasn't really about James's expertise. It was about acquiring what the Hartwell Ranch represented: the land, the cattle, and maybe even the woman who'd helped make it profitable. "Mr. Garrett," she said, stepping forward with the same poise she'd once used when facing down difficult customers in her father's store. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "I'm Rebecca Collins, the ranch manager here." Garrett's eyebrows rose. "Ranch manager? How progressive of you, Hartwell." The condescension in his tone made James's jaw tighten, but Rebecca maintained her calm smile. "I handle the books, manage the breeding program, and coordinate the cattle operations. It's been quite successful. We're taking 22 head to market today, all of them in prime condition despite the harsh winter." "Impressive," Garrett said, though his tone suggested he found it anything but. "And what did you do before you came to work for Hartwell?" The question was loaded with implications, and Rebecca recognized the trap. A woman with her capabilities working as a ranch manager was unusual enough to raise questions about her background, questions that could lead to uncomfortable revelations about her family's disgrace back in Pennsylvania. "I've been ranching most of my life," she said simply. "This is just the first place that's appreciated what I can contribute." James moved to stand beside her, a gesture of support that wasn't lost on any of them. "Rebecca's the best ranch manager I've ever worked with. Don't know how I manage without her." Garrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, if you change your mind about my offer, Hartwell, you know where to find me. Though I should mention, I'm always looking for capable people. The right person could have quite a comfortable life working for an operation like mine." The offer was clearly directed at Rebecca, and the implication was obvious. Garrett had plenty of money and could provide the kind of security and social standing that a small ranch never could. "Thank you for the offer," Rebecca replied evenly, "but I'm quite happy where I am." After Garrett left, the easy warmth of the morning had dissipated. James worked with unusual intensity, throwing himself into preparations for the cattle drive with more force than necessary. Rebecca could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw stayed tight even when he spoke to Tommy. "He's not wrong, you know," James said finally as they loaded supplies for the trip to town. "About the security. About what could happen to a small operation like this." Rebecca stopped loading grain sacks and turned to face him. "Are you having doubts about the ranch?" "I'm having doubts about whether I have the right to ask you to tie your future to something this uncertain." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. After everything they'd been through together, after the way she'd risked her life to save his cattle, he was still thinking of her as someone who might be better off elsewhere. "James Hartwell," she said, her voice sharp with emotion, "are you seriously suggesting I'd be happier working for that pompous peacock than I am here? I'm suggesting you deserve better than a man who can barely make ends meet on a ranch that's one bad season away from foreclosure." Rebecca set down the grain sack and moved closer to him, close enough to see the doubt and fear in his eyes. "What I deserve is a man who sees me as a partner, not as someone to be protected from hard choices. What I deserve is a place where my work matters, where I'm valued for who I am, not what I represent." "Rebecca." "No, let me finish." She placed her hands on his chest, feeling his heart beat rapid and strong beneath her palms. "I've had offers before, James, not just from Garrett, but from other men who saw a woman without family or protection and thought they could provide for me in exchange for companionship. I turned them all down because none of them saw me. They saw what they thought I should be." James covered her hands with his own. And what do you think I see? I think you see a woman who's strong enough to walk into a blizzard to save your cattle. I think you see someone who can balance your books and birth your calves and help your son heal from losing his mother. I think you see a partner. I see all of that, James said quietly. And I see the woman I've been falling in love with since the day you refused to stay down when life knocked you flat. The words hung between them like a bridge neither had been brave enough to cross until now. Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. I love you too, she whispered. Not because you rescued me, but because you gave me the chance to rescue myself. Because you let me be strong when everyone else wanted me to be grateful. James cupped her face in his work-roughened hands. Rebecca Collins, will you marry me? Not because you need security or because I need help running this place, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Rebecca's answer was to rise on her tiptoes and kiss him with all the passion she'd been holding back for months. It was a kiss that tasted of new beginnings and hard-won happiness, of love that had grown from mutual respect and shared struggles. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Tommy's voice came from the porch where he'd been watching with wide-eyed delight. Does this mean Miss Rebecca's going to be my mama for real? Rebecca laughed through her tears and held out her arms to the boy who'd already claimed such a large piece of her heart. If you'll have me, sweetheart. Tommy launched himself into her embrace with the trust of a child who'd finally found the family he'd been missing. As James wrapped his arms around both of them, Rebecca felt the last piece of her broken life click into place. She'd arrived at this ranch desperate and begging for any chance to survive. She was staying as a woman who'd found not just love, but her true worth in the eyes of people who mattered. Spring had brought more than just new grass and wildflowers to the Hartwell Ranch. It had brought the promise of a future built on love, partnership, and the kind of happiness that came from being exactly where you belong. Rebecca Hartwell stood in the doorway of the ranch house kitchen, watching her husband teach their son how to properly saddle a horse in the morning light. The gold band on her finger caught the sunshine streaming through the window, and she still felt a small thrill of joy every time she saw it there. A symbol of belonging that had nothing to do with desperation and everything to do with love freely given and received. The wedding had been simple, held in the parlor of their own home, with only the circuit preacher, Old Pete, and Tommy as witnesses. Rebecca had worn Sarah's best dress, altered to fit her perfectly, and carried wildflowers that Tommy had picked himself. It had been everything she'd never known she wanted. Intimate, genuine, and filled with the quiet joy of people who'd found their way to happiness through their own strength and determination. Mama Rebecca, Tommy called out, the title he'd chosen for her rolling off his tongue with natural ease. Come see how straight I got the saddle. Rebecca stepped onto the porch, her heart swelling with pride as she watched the boy who'd become her son in every way that mattered. Tommy had grown 3 inches over the summer. His face had filled out with regular meals and happiness, and he chattered constantly now, a complete transformation from the silent, grief-stricken child she'd first met. Perfect, she said, examining his work with the serious attention it deserved. Your papa taught you well. James caught her eye over Tommy's head and smiled, the same warm look that had been making her pulse quicken for months now. Marriage had only deepened the partnership they'd built together, in bed, in business, in the daily rhythms of ranch life that required 2 people working in perfect harmony. Mrs. Hartwell, James said, his voice carrying the teasing formality he used when he wanted to remind her how far they'd both traveled from that first desperate meeting in the muddy yard. We've got visitors coming up the drive. Rebecca shaded her eyes and looked toward the main road, where a familiar buggy was raising dust clouds in the distance. Her heart jumped with recognition and something that might have been nervousness. That's the Garrett carriage, she said. James's expression tightened slightly. William Garrett had been persistent in his pursuit of both the Hartwell Ranch's land and Rebecca's attention, making increasingly generous offers and increasingly obvious advances despite her marriage. His latest scheme involved claiming that Rebecca's presence at the ranch was somehow improper, spreading whispers in town about her background and suggesting that a woman of uncertain reputation shouldn't be managing a respectable operation. What do you think he wants this time? James asked, his hand moving instinctively to rest on Rebecca's waist in a gesture of protection and possession. Probably another offer to buy us out, Rebecca replied, though she suspected Garrett's motives ran deeper than simple business. Or maybe he's finally ready to accept that we're not interested in anything he's selling. The carriage that stopped in their yard was even more elaborate than Garrett's usual transportation. Polished to a high shine and pulled by matching bay horses that clearly cost more than most people made in a year. But it wasn't William Garrett who stepped down from the driver's seat. It was a woman Rebecca recognized with a mixture of shock and dread. "Hello, Rebecca," said Mrs. Eleanor Hartford, the wife of Pennsylvania's most prominent banker and the woman who'd led the social campaign that had driven Rebecca's family out of their hometown. She was exactly as Rebecca remembered, elegantly dressed, perfectly composed, and radiating the kind of moral superiority that could cut through steel. Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face, but she kept her voice steady. "Mrs. Hartford, this is unexpected." "I imagine it is." Mrs. Hartford's gaze swept over the ranch with obvious disdain, taking in the practical buildings, the working corrals, and Rebecca's simple day dress with the expression of someone examining something distasteful. "When I heard rumors that you'd surfaced in the Colorado Territory, I felt compelled to see for myself what sort of situation you'd managed to create." James stepped forward, his presence solid and reassuring beside Rebecca. "Ma'am, I'm James Hartwell, Rebecca's husband. If you have business with my wife, you're welcome to state it plainly." Mrs. Hartford's eyebrows rose. "Husband? How fascinating. I wasn't aware that Rebecca had found someone willing to overlook her history." Rebecca felt rage begin to build in her chest, but before she could respond, Tommy appeared at her side, slipping his hand into hers with the instinctive loyalty of a child who sensed threat to someone he loved. "This is my mama," Tommy announced with 6-year-old directness. "She's the best mama in the whole territory." Mrs. Hartford's gaze fixed on Tommy with something approaching horror. "Surely you don't mean to tell me that you've allowed this woman to influence a child? Given her family's disgrace, her complete lack of moral standing..." "That's enough." James's voice cut through Mrs. Hartford's words like a blade. "I don't know what you think you know about my wife's past, but I know everything I need to know about her character. She's the strongest, most honorable woman I've ever met, and she's an exceptional mother to my son." "Honorable?" Mrs. Hartford laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. "Perhaps you're unaware that Rebecca's father embezzled money from his own customers, that her family fled Pennsylvania to escape criminal charges, that she herself was suspected of being involved in the scheme." The words hit Rebecca like physical blows, each accusation dragging her back to the shame and helplessness she'd felt when her world collapsed. For a moment, she was that desperate woman again, kneeling in the mud and begging for any chance to survive. Then she felt James's hand find hers, felt Tommy's small fingers tighten in her grasp, and remembered who she'd become since that terrible day. "You're right," Rebecca said quietly, her voice steady despite the pain lancing through her chest. "My father was a thief and a coward who stole from people who trusted him. My family was disgraced, and I was guilty by association in the eyes of people like you." Mrs. Hartford's smile was triumphant. "Then you admit..." "I admit that I was judged without trial, condemned without evidence, and driven from my home by people who cared more about appearances than truth." Rebecca stepped forward, drawing strength from the anger that had been building for months as she watched Garrett's increasingly desperate attempts to discredit her. "But what I won't admit is that any of that defines who I am now." She gestured toward the thriving ranch around them. "This place was failing when I arrived. The books were a mess, the breeding program was haphazard, and the winter would have wiped them out completely if I hadn't risked my life to save the cattle. I built this success with my own hands, my own knowledge, my own determination." "Rebecca," James said softly, but she wasn't finished. "I've balanced budgets, delivered calves, managed livestock, and proven myself in ways that matter out here. I've earned the respect of every rancher in this territory through my work, not my family connections or social standing." Rebecca's voice grew stronger with each word. And I've given a good man a partner who values him for who he is, not what he can provide. I've given a grieving little boy a mother who sees his worth and helps him grow into the person he's meant to be. Mrs. Hartford's composure was beginning to crack. Your past. My past made me strong enough to survive anything, including the judgment of people who mistake pedigree for character. Rebecca smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. You came here thinking you could destroy the life I've built by exposing my shame. But all you've done is remind me how far I've traveled from the woman who cared what people like you thought of her. Tommy tugged on Rebecca's skirt. Mama, who is this mean lady? Rebecca knelt down to Tommy's level, ignoring Mrs. Hartford's sharp intake of breath at the casual intimacy. This is someone from my old life, sweetheart. Someone who thinks a person's worth comes from their family's reputation instead of their own actions. That's silly, Tommy said with the clear logic of childhood. You're the best mama ever, and Papa loves you, and you saved all our cows in the blizzard. What does it matter what her family did? Out of the mouths of babes. Rebecca hugged Tommy close, feeling the last traces of shame and fear finally dissolve. It doesn't matter at all, baby. Not one bit. When she stood, James was looking at her with an expression of such pride and love that it took her breath away. I've never heard anything more beautiful than listening to my wife refuse to be ashamed of the strength that brought her to me, he said. Mrs. Hartford looked between them with obvious frustration. This is exactly the kind of moral corruption I expected to find. A woman of questionable background, a man too isolated to understand proper standards. Ma'am, James interrupted, his voice polite but implacable. I'm going to ask you to leave my property now. You've said what you came to say, and you've heard our response. There's nothing more to discuss. You'll regret this, Mrs. Hartford said as she climbed back into her carriage. When the truth about what kind of woman you've married becomes known throughout the territory, then people will know I married a woman brave enough to start over when life knocked her down, James replied. A woman strong enough to save a failing ranch and wise enough to help a broken family heal. If that's the truth you want to spread, ma'am, I encourage you to tell it far and wide. As the carriage disappeared down the drive, Rebecca felt James's arms come around her from behind, solid and warm and reassuring. Tommy pressed against her side, his loyalty absolute despite not fully understanding what had just happened. How are you doing? James asked quietly. Rebecca leaned back against his chest, watching the dust settle on the road that led away from their ranch, toward a world that had never understood her worth. I'm better than I've ever been, she said honestly. For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I belong, with people who love me for who I am instead of who they think I should be. And where is that? Rebecca turned in his arms, seeing her future reflected in the eyes of the man who'd given her a chance to prove herself when no one else would. Home, she said simply. This is home. As the afternoon sun painted the Colorado sky in shades of gold and promise, the Hartwell family stood together on their porch, watching their cattle graze in pastures they'd saved through their own courage and determination. They'd all traveled far from where they'd started. James from bitter widowhood to love, Tommy from grief-stricken silence to joy, Rebecca from desperate shame to confident happiness. But they'd arrived at the same destination, a life built on love, respect, and the unshakable knowledge that worth isn't determined by where you come from, but by who you choose to become when given the chance to be your truest self. Some stories end with vindication. Some end with revenge against those who cause pain. But the best stories end with the simple, profound happiness of people who found their way home to each other despite every obstacle the world tried to put in their path. And this story, Rebecca knew with absolute certainty, was just beginning. 2 years later, the Hartwell Ranch had become something of a legend in the Colorado Territory, not just for its prosperity, but for the story of the woman who'd helped transform it from a struggling operation into one of the most successful ranches in 3 counties. Rebecca stood in the doorway of the new barn, twice the size of the original, and built with the profits from 2 record-breaking cattle seasons, watching her 8-year-old son Tommy teach proper horse care to the Henderson children who'd come for their weekly riding lessons. Hold the brush like this, Mary. Tommy was saying with the patience of someone who'd learned from the best teachers. You want to go with the grain of the coat, not against it. Horses like gentle but firm pressure. Rebecca smiled, remembering her own first fumbling attempts to help with the livestock when she'd arrived here desperate and inexperienced. Now Tommy was passing on skills he'd learned naturally, growing up on a ranch that had become the heart of a thriving community. The sound of wagon wheels on the drive made her look up to see familiar faces arriving for the monthly gathering that had become tradition at the Hartwell place. Sarah Henderson with her two youngest children, the Brewster family from the South Range, Old Pete with his fiddle, and a dozen other neighbors who'd become chosen family over the years. "Rebecca!" Sarah Henderson called out, hurrying forward with the enthusiasm of a woman who'd found her dearest friend. "Wait until you see what came in the mail for you from Denver." Rebecca accepted the official-looking envelope with curiosity, noting the Colorado Territorial Government seal. When she opened it, her eyes widened with surprise. "What is it?" asked James, emerging from the house with a tray of fresh coffee for their guests. "It's a letter from the territorial governor," Rebecca said, her voice slightly incredulous. "He's asking me to serve on the new Agricultural Advisory Board. Apparently my work with cattle breeding and ranch management has been noticed." James's grin was pure pride. "The first woman ever appointed to a territorial board? That's my wife. Never content with just breaking ground, you have to shatter it completely." Rebecca looked at the letter again, thinking about the woman who'd knelt in this very yard 4 years ago, begging for any work that would keep her alive another day. That woman could never have imagined being recognized by territorial authorities for her expertise, let alone being asked to help shape policy for the entire region. "Mama Rebecca," called a new voice from the porch. Rebecca turned to see 4-year-old Sarah Hartwell, the daughter she and James had welcomed 2 years earlier, toddling toward them with the determined gait of a child who'd inherited her parents' stubborn independence. Rebecca scooped up the little girl, marveling as she did every day at the miracle of holding a child who was truly hers in every way. Sarah had James's dark hair and eyes, but Rebecca's determined chin, and she was already showing signs of the fierce intelligence that ran in both their families. "What's all the excitement about, little one?" Rebecca asked, settling Sarah on her hip. "Tommy's teaching the big kids about horses, and Mrs. Henderson brought cake, and Papa said we might have dancing later if Uncle Pete brought his fiddle." Uncle Pete was no relation, but the children of the territory had adopted him as honorary family, just as they'd created their own definitions of what family meant in a place where blood ties mattered less than loyalty and love. As the afternoon wore on, Rebecca found herself moving through the familiar rhythms of community gathering, helping serve food, mediating disputes between children, listening to neighbors share news and concerns. But today felt different somehow, charged with significance in a way she couldn't quite name. The realization came as she watched Tommy and Sarah playing with the other children while James and the men discussed plans for a new schoolhouse. This was what she'd been building toward all along, not just personal happiness, but something larger. A community where children could grow up safe and valued, where families supported each other through hardships, where a person's worth was measured by their contributions rather than their background. "You're thinking deep thoughts," observed James, sliding an arm around her waist as they watched their children play. "I was thinking about legacy," Rebecca said, "about what we leave behind when we're gone." "And what conclusion did you reach?" Rebecca gestured toward the scene before them. Children learning from each other, families gathering in friendship, a community built on the foundation of mutual respect and shared values. "I think legacy isn't about what we accumulate. It's about what we make possible for the people who come after us." As evening approached and old Pete tuned his fiddle for the dancing that would follow supper, Rebecca found herself standing in the spot where she'd first knelt before James, desperate and broken. The contrast was so stark it almost took her breath away. She thought about Mrs. Hartford's visit 2 years ago, about the woman who traveled halfway across the country to shame her with a past that no longer had any power over her present. Since then, Rebecca had heard rumors that her story had spread throughout the territory, not as a cautionary tale about fallen women, but as an inspiration about second chances in the courage to rebuild. Women wrote to her from as far away as California, asking for advice about starting over after loss or scandal. Some came in person, arriving at the ranch with the same desperate hope Rebecca had carried in her own heart years earlier. The Hartwells had never turned anyone away, and their home had become an unofficial sanctuary for women who needed time and space to discover their own strength. "Mama," Tommy said, appearing at her side with the sudden materialization that children seem to master. "Mrs. Henderson said you used to be very sad before you came to live with us. Is that true?" Rebecca looked down at the boy who'd become her son in every way that mattered. This child who'd grown from silent grief to confident joy with the help of time and unconditional love. "I was very sad," she said honestly. "I'd lost everything I thought was important, and I didn't know how to be happy anymore. But then you found us," Tommy said, with the simple logic of childhood. "Actually, I think we found each other," Rebecca replied. "Sometimes when people are meant to be family, they find a way to come together, even when it seems impossible." As the music started and couples began gathering for the first dance, James appeared beside them with Sarah perched on his shoulders and mischief in his eyes. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said with mock formality, "might I have the honor of this dance?" Rebecca laughed and took his offered hand, remembering the first time they danced together at a community gathering 3 years ago. She'd been nervous then, still uncertain of her place in this community, still half convinced that someone would discover she didn't really belong. Now she danced with the confidence of a woman who knew exactly where she belonged and why. The music was lively and the steps were simple, but as Rebecca spun in her husband's arms, surrounded by friends who'd become family, she felt the profound satisfaction of a life lived authentically. She thought about the women who would come after her, who would face their own moments of desperation and choice, who would need to find their own courage to rebuild from ashes. She thought about the agricultural board position and the opportunity it represented to help shape policies that would benefit families like theirs. She thought about the schoolhouse they were planning to build, where children would learn not just reading and arithmetic, but also the values of hard work, community support, and judging people by their character rather than their circumstances. But mostly she thought about the simple miracle of being exactly where she was meant to be, with people who loved her not despite her past, but because of how that past had shaped her into someone worth loving. As the evening wore on and neighbors began heading home to their own ranches and families, Rebecca stood on the porch holding Sarah, while Tommy helped James bank the fire and put away the chairs. The stars overhead were the same ones that had looked down on her during her darkest nights, but everything else had transformed completely. "No regrets?" James asked, echoing the question he'd been asking her for years now. Rebecca looked at their thriving ranch, at the community they'd helped build, at the children who would grow up knowing they were valued and loved. She thought about the woman she'd become through adversity and choice, about the legacy of love and strength she was passing on to the next generation. "Only that it took me so long to understand that worth isn't something other people give you," she said. "It's something you claim for yourself by living up to your own values rather than other people's expectations." James kissed her temple, his arms circling both her and their daughter in an embrace that felt like the safest place in the world. "I love you, Rebecca Hartwell," he said, "for who you were when I met you, for who you've become, and for who you're still becoming." As they stood together under the Colorado stars, surrounded by the life they'd built with their own hands and hearts, Rebecca knew that some stories don't end with happily ever after. The best stories end with happily ever continuing, with the promise that love and courage and determination can overcome any obstacle, that second chances are always possible for those brave enough to take them, and that sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin when we finally have the courage to write our own story instead of living the one other people think we should have. The Hartwell Ranch would continue to prosper. The community would continue to grow. Children would continue to learn that their worth came from their character rather than their circumstances. And Rebecca would continue to be living proof that sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with the simple act of refusing to give up, even when giving up seems like the only option left. Some loves are worth waiting for. Some dreams are worth fighting for. And some women are strong enough to rise from the ashes of their old lives to build something more beautiful than they ever dared imagine. This was one of those stories, and it was just beginning. And that's how Rebecca Collins became Rebecca Hartwell, How a woman who arrived begging for work in torn clothes became the territory's first female agricultural advisor, and how one family proved that worth isn't determined by where you start, but by who you choose to become when given the chance. Think about the journey we just witnessed. A woman stripped of everything, family, reputation, security, found the courage to keep going when surrender seemed like the only option. A man who could have seen her as just another burden instead recognized her potential and gave her the space to prove herself. A grieving child discovered that families can be built on love and choice rather than just blood. But this story reaches far beyond romance and frontier adventures. It's about the transformative power of seeing people for who they truly are instead of judging them by their circumstances. James didn't hire Rebecca because he felt sorry for her. He hired her because he recognized her strength, her intelligence, and her determination to contribute rather than just survive. Rebecca's arc reminds us that rock bottom can be a foundation rather than an ending. She could have remained trapped by shame about her family's disgrace, could have accepted that her past defined her future. Instead, she chose to let her actions speak louder than her history, proving her worth through competence, courage, and compassion. The blizzard scene where Rebecca risked her life to save the cattle isn't just dramatic action. It's the moment she fully claimed her place in her new life. She wasn't just protecting James's investment, she was fighting for her own future, for Tommy's security, for the home she'd found worth dying for. James's character shows us what it means to truly see someone's potential. He could have offered Rebecca charity, temporary help, or simple kindness. Instead, he offered her partnership, responsibility, and the chance to prove herself as an equal. That distinction made all the difference between rescue and empowerment. Even the confrontation with Mrs. Hartford serves a crucial purpose. It shows Rebecca finally rejecting the power of past shame over present reality. The woman who once cared desperately about social approval had grown into someone who valued authentic relationships over artificial respectability. This story unfolded in the 1880s Colorado, but its themes are timeless. How many of us have felt defined by our worst moments or our family's failures? How many have had to choose between accepting others' limitations of us or fighting to prove our true capabilities? How many have discovered that the most powerful transformations begin with someone believing in our potential before we believe in it ourselves? Rebecca and James's love story succeeds because it's built on mutual respect and shared values rather than dependency or desperation. They didn't complete each other. They enhanced each other, each bringing their own strengths to create something larger than either could achieve alone. Tommy's healing reminds us that children are remarkably resilient when surrounded by consistent love and security. His journey from silence to joy mirrors the ranch's transformation from struggling to thriving. Both needed time, patience, and the right combination of care and challenge. What did you think of Rebecca's refusal to be ashamed of her past? Could you have James's wisdom to see potential where others saw only problems? Have you ever experienced the transformative power of someone believing in you before you believed in yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing how these frontier tales of courage and second chances inspire your own life journey. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that worth comes from character rather than circumstances, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message of hope and transformation. Subscribe to Wild West Stories for more incredible tales proving that the human spirit can overcome any obstacle, and ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest adventures from America's frontier. Remember, your past doesn't define your future. Your choices do. And sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin when we finally have the courage to write our own story instead of living the one others think we deserve. Thanks for joining Rebecca on her journey from desperation to dignity, proving that with courage, determination, and people who believe in us, we can rise from any ashes to build something beautiful. Like this video if you believe second chances are always possible for those brave enough to take them, and subscribe for more legendary frontier stories that prove love and dignity can triumph over any circumstances.